Right, good evening, everybody. Very welcome to the Irish College. Very welcome to this, one of the first events of the Leuven Centre for Irish Studies. We're very glad to have the Director of Irish Studies here, Elke Donker. And we have writers here, 3 writers, no less, one from the Republic, one from the border with the North, and one who's in the diaspora. Because Siobhán is a person who actually belongs to the Open University. She teaches creative writing in the Open University, and so you would call that the diaspora, especially because she lives in the embassy. So if that's not diaspora, I don't know what is. So I'm actually not going to introduce these people because that's what Siobhán is going to do, but I just wanted to say that Siobhán herself has agreed to be the moderator for tonight, that she's herself a poet, an author of 6 books of poetry, for which she won the Templar Poetry Prize, awards in the National Poetry Competition, the Troubadour International Competition, as well as an award from the Arts Council. And her interests in post-conflict and cross-community work are very important to us here in this college, because we try to connect culture with social work, with real life, and with politics. So we're very glad to have people like you here, and I give you the floor.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Please come in. I'm sure we can find you a chair. It's great to see so many coming out tonight to welcome Jaki McCarrick and Mary O'Donnell. So we're going to keep things pretty informal. We'll be having a chat later. You'll be able to ask your questions as well. So it's a chance to talk to these 2 writers who are currently, as you know, the writers in residence here in the college. So I will introduce them as much as I can. I can only give you a snippet of what these wonderful writers have been up to. So poet, short story writer and novelist Mary O'Donnell was born in County Monaghan and studied German and philosophy at the National University of Ireland, Maynooth. As Poetry Foundation Chicago says, Mary O'Donnell's work is often cited as expanding the horizons of Ireland's formerly male-dominated literary world. True statement. Mary's 8 poetry collections include Unlegendary Heroes and Those April Fevers. 4 novels include Where They Lie, and her best-selling debut novel, The Lightmakers, which was reissued in 2017 by 451 Editions. Mary's stories have been in several publications, including Stand magazine, The Fiddlehead Review, The Incubator, Prole, and the anthology The Glass Shore. Mary's most recent collection of short stories, Empire, which focuses on social and family situations before, during, and after the Irish Rising in 1916, was also published by 451, and she may read from it this evening. And Mary won the Fish International Short Story Competition in 2010, among other awards, including a Hennessy Literature Award and an Allingham Award. Her most recent poetry collection, which some people interpret as an eco poetry book, maybe we could talk about that, no, says Mary, is called Massacre of the Birds. So it's always good to generate a bit of controversy. And that's published by Salmon. And Mary's essay, My Mother in Drumlin Country, was published in New Hibernia Review and listed among notable essays in Best American Essays. Mary is a member of Ace Donna in Ireland, and her 5th novel is due any time. I think she's gestating the last proofs of it at the moment. Among my many favourites of Mary's are works which focus on actually what Hedwig just said, the social and political realities. Mary's never afraid to take on the big themes, the big serious themes of our day. And she often focuses in on the extraordinary and the ordinary. So, for instance, the poem itself, called Unlegendary Heroes, captures that kind of amazing moment in the effort of ordinary people. So I'm quoting Kathleen McKenna Anagola, who was able to wash a week's sheets, shirts and swaddling, bake bread and clean the house all of a Monday. Or Anne Moffat of Ena, who taught people to read and did not charge. And Mary there is using the census of an area of Ulster, the old county of Ulster, which includes where Mary is from, to investigate, to use research really to inspire certain kinds of poems. So maybe we can hear more about that later on. So turning to Jaki McCarrick, who's also an award-winning writer of plays, poetry and fiction. In this case, Jaki has won the Papa Tango Prize for new writing for her play Leopoldville. Jaki's play Belfast Girls was developed at the National Theatre Studio London and has been staged many times internationally. And it's been shortlisted for the Susan Smith Blackburn Prize and the BBC Tony Doyle Award. And it's now going into several languages, and you can catch the current Swedish trailer on YouTube, which is really worth seeing. And also there, since Belfast Girls made its New York premiere at the Irish Repertory Theatre this summer, there's also a trailer of the Irish Repertory New York premiere. Jaki's plays have been published by Samuel French, by Routledge and Aurora Metro, and have also been translated into several languages. Jaki's debut fiction collection, The Scattering, was shortlisted for the 2014 Edgehill Prize and includes her Wasafiri Prize-winning story, The Visit. In 2020, Jaki was shortlisted for the Unpost Book Awards Short Story of the Year for The Emperor of Russia, a story you have to seek out. It's just an amazing piece of work. Jaki was writer-in-residence at the Centre Culturel Irlandais in Paris in 2013. She's written critical work for the Times Literary Supplement, the Irish Examiner, Poetry Ireland Review, and other places. Longlisted in 2014 for the inaugural Irish Fiction Laureate, Jaki is currently working on a second collection of short stories, on a screenplay of Belfast Girls, on a musical, on a novel, on a first collection of poetry, and she just tells me she's produced a short story while she's been here. So if that doesn't exhaust you, I don't know what will. Belfast Girls focuses on women shipped to Australia during the Irish famine, under the Famine Orphan Scheme, not something I had known about, so really fascinating. And again, the theme of historical and social research that can underpin excellent writing of both these writers. There are great parts for 5 actresses in this play. They're playing 5 amazing survivors, all going on either an escape or a quest or some kind of extraordinary adventure. It's a play full of secrets and revelations. And Alyssa Gardner of New York Stage Review says, with crisp, absorbing dialogue, Belfast Girls offers a fresh perspective on the myths that still dominate popular narratives. So both our writers this evening have a clear-eyed tendency to puncture long-held myths, to force readers to deal with actual historical and social realities in the work. And I just think we should welcome them because they're both fantastic. So welcome. So I thought we'd kick off with some easy questions and then, work up to the hard ones. Let me see. People often ask about how much of writing is inspiration and how much is perspiration. So keeping that in mind, could you say something about how you might be inspired by topical events, or does it take quite a while for your own experiences to sort of temper down into your writing? I'll start with you, Jaki.
Perspiration, inspiration, mostly perspiration, but it's lovely when the inspiration comes as well. Topical, sometimes I find that if I get an idea and I'll work on an idea, and then possibly because I'm very involved in that idea, I'm just thinking maybe of Belfast Girls, there wasn't, it seems to be a combination of things. I mean, what started me on the quest for that was the recession that happened in Ireland in 2008, and lots of things happened. Then I find this idea, and then there are mechanics and things that happened in that recession that found its way into the idea, if you see what I mean. So it's like once I had an idea, that some kind of channel is open, and then, you know, what's happening in the world enters the idea as well. I think that was going on there a lot. But mostly perspiration. That's the thing I've got the biggest relationship with, not really inspiration. Sorry.
So we're guessing perspiration involves drafting and redrafting.
Yeah.
Mary, can you tell us more about
Yes,
it?
yes, there is a lot of perspiration really, but I think that's where the inspired stuff can happen. I do really. But I know that, you see, I've had the different experiences of being a poet as well as a prose writer, and I started out as a poet, and I think that when I was younger, I used to get what I would call the feeling. This feeling. Do you know that? You know, when
I think so.
When you're younger, I think you're more possibly one is more awakened towards the transcendent or those sort of little things. And I used to experience that, and it was I knew I had to write a poem, and I might not even be entirely sure what it was going to be about. And that's how I often worked when I was younger. I found maybe more as I mastered my craft, I don't know, maybe I depended more on having a definite idea, oh, I must write about that. So the title poem of my first collection is called Reading the Sunflowers in September. And it was inspired by an account of anorexia that I heard on the radio. Now, this would have been in the mid-1980s, so it's a long time ago. And, you know, young women really describing their experience of it and what it meant to them. And at the same time, I, in my real life, had been nurturing sunflowers in the garden. And because we were in Ireland and don't get much sun, I was force feeding them with biofeed so that they would grow big. And suddenly, these two things came together for me. The idea of a girl in the poem who wants to be essentially genderless, and she's starving herself into this, but there's also these sunflowers that are being forced to be bigger than they would naturally be. That for me, maybe that poem was a mixture of inspiration and craft, but the two things came together, you know. And I find that now that I'm, well, just now, I sometimes find, oh, I do want to write about X. So the idea for this book, Empire, came to me when I was lying on a beach abroad in 2010, and I decided I wanted to write a book that would come out in 2016, which was the centenary of the Irish Rebellion Rising. And of course it didn't come out then, it came out in 2018. Nevertheless, something came to me then, and I just worked from there. But I totally agree with Jackie that it is just sitting down and working and applying yourself and having a little mental meter that's going yes or no as you adjust things. That's not my idea. It's what's his name, the guy who wrote Lincoln in the Bardo.
George Saunders.
George Saunders refers to this as a method of working, and you're constantly adjusting. But I think that's a kind of inspiration, even though it is craft.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. But my takeaway from that story, however, is we should all lie on a beach more often. So as you both write across several genres, this is sort of fascinating for me, who's stuck in poetry, hoping to break out sometime. But could you talk to us about, is there something about the quality of an idea that you decide which form you're going to write it in, or do you try it in one form and then try it in another, or what happens? Tell us.
I have had crossover ideas. The Leopoldville was originally a short story. I mean, it was an extension of that short story, and that's only because I was wondering, I found myself looking out the window of a bus one day and wondering about the character in this particular short story, which is about a crime that happens in Dundalk in 1990. and wondering what happened to this guy. And that made me think, oh, I've not done with that yet. I'm not finished with that. So then I wrote the play. And so it's not the same story, but it's something to do with that character. And then there's a few things like that. I won't go on, but I have a few crossovers like that. And really, they're just about being sensitive, I suppose, to whether something's not finished. And then this other part of your question, is something a poem, is something a story, is something a drama or whatever. I just think that's an instinct, you know. And I've often thought even something like Belfast Girls could have been a novel, because it's got some kind of intensity in the drama. It could have been a novel, but it was a play. And maybe was a sense of urgency to get the voices out. Yeah, whether it's one of these forms, I personally think that's an instinct thing. But yeah, things can cross over. And to me, that's about unfinished business with characters or the idea.
That rings very true to me, even in poetry itself. You keep returning to the same set of themes until they eventually let you go.
Exactly.
You've exhausted them.
How do you find deciding, Mary, on forms? Or does
well, I suppose I usually have a sense of what form it should be in, all right, because you know what I said earlier about the feeling in relation to poetry. I still do get the feeling, and I know something is going to become poetry. It's just something, I can't put it in words what it is, but I feel it's like you feel a poem coming on. And so you have to do a draft anyway before you go to bed or something. But it's very different and much more deliberate for me with fiction. And I always think of myself sometimes as I'm coming to it with my tools and all, you know, your lifetime of reading going in and all the stuff that's going through you, you know, that we all carry as life goes on. And I suppose that's feeding you unconsciously or subconsciously. And that moment when you know that something isn't quite finished did occur for me with the title story of a short story collection called Storm Over Belfast. And I realised after the collection came out and on rereading this story that I could do a lot more with this, and I felt that there was something in the two characters I didn't want to leave. And so it became the novel Where They Lie as a result. And so with very little residue of the original story left in the novel. But it's what pushed me into it.
It's very interesting to hear you say characters, because when I was reading both your work as a preparation to revisiting both your work as a preparation, it was definitely the characters just leaping off those pages. You have a tenement child in Empire, I think it is, and your you know, shady women, if I can call one or two of them that, in Belfast Girls. I mean, I'd really love to meet these characters and sit them down, but that speaks volumes, doesn't it? Because if you want to sit down and have a chat with somebody over a coffee or something stronger, then they've really made an impression on you, you know, and they're fully formed. But what we might do now is ask you to introduce a piece of work. Tell us what inspired it, possibly how it arose rather, and maybe give us a reading. Yeah, sure. We'll start with you, Jackie, if that's okay.
Okay. Just read for how long?
7-8 minutes.
That's what
well, I'm going to read from The Emperor of Russia, which was shortlisted for the Unpost Short Story Award in 2020, but I've never read from it before. This is the first time. It has its roots, because you said where it came from, it has its roots in a short play called Crow's Wake. And, you know, short plays, who's going to put them on? They're very short. They probably just end up in a reading festival somewhere. And I loved the two characters in this short play, and so I wanted to do something with them. I just didn't want them to, you know, I like to do things with, especially if I like characters. So I turn them into this story. So I shall read a bit from
wonderful story. Thank you.
I'll just sit. Will I sit?
Oh yeah, whatever feels comfortable. Can everybody hear us?
Can you hear me? Will I shout? Will I project a bit more? I stand. Will I stand? Okay. So just to say, it's set a few miles from where I live on the border in Ireland, and it's mostly in the voice of, I've written this word, but ballsy, a teenage girl. So I'll do my best. Okay. The Emperor of Russia. I could hear my father singing in the lower fields. In between the lines of the poorly sung Joe Dolan number, he would call for me, each time more demanding, though he did not bother to draw near to where I actually was, which was at the back of the house pegging his newly washed clothes to the line. I knew I'd give in eventually to his calls, but I wanted him to hurt his voice as much as possible with the screeching. "Rose, come down to the big tree," he said. Finally, his song ended. When I finished the laundry, I sauntered towards him. Of course, it was me who let out the loudest screech of all when I got to the lower field, where he stood by the eucalyptus tree in his brown pinstripe suit with its shiny stains and frayed cuffs, leaning on his pellet gun. Hanging from a high branch of the tree was a crow, plump and stiff, and I knew straight away by the white in its feathers that it was Hermione, my brother's pet, and that my bastard father had killed her. I fell to my knees and cried out, worse than at any time when he'd left us first and gone to England. Crows are a dime a dozen, wee one, and you better stop with that whining, my father said. There wasn't an ounce of remorse in his voice. You'd no business doing that, I said. I told you what we'd be doing to stop the crop getting took off us from under our noses, didn't I? A certain measure your mother would have none of, but she's not here now, is she? He was right, of course. He had told me what he'd planned to do to a crow. And yes, my mother wasn't around to protest. She died in the years he was away. And here he was now, as he'd been this past while, acting as if he knew everything about how to run our farm, when truth was he knew next to nothing about farming. He was just as he was before. All he was good for was guns and shooting, and everyone knew it. Hanging a dead crow from a tree is a practice they used to do in the country, in the border areas especially, to ward off other crows from the new barley, wheat spuds. The belief was that crows, being sensitive, intelligent birds, would spend a week waking their fellow dead crow. And in that time, the crop would be harvested. I'd seen it once before, years ago, a pair of crows hanging from blue rope off the gate to a backwoods field in O'Meath. Julian's been rearing her since she was a chick fell out of her nest, I said. The one white wing, the crack in the beak. How could you do a thing like that? I went to the ladder lying in the grass by my father's feet, picked it up and brought it to the tree. What you doing, Rose? He said, as I rested the ladder against the eucalyptus. Go and bury in this bird, that's what. I'm not leaving it here for you to poke and swing and for to call me down from the house to goad at it. On the third step of the ladder, I winced at the grip of his sizable fingers. You'll not be burying this bird today, he said. I couldn't help myself then. I looked him straight in the eye and said, well, aren't you the bastard Ma married? He went to slap my face as he'd done a few times before, though he stopped due to the stern look I gave him. It is hilarious to consider how much respect my father demands from me and Julian. It's like he thinks that by virtue of the fact he conceived us, he's the right to the utmost loyalty and respect. Though from where I stood on the ladder, eye to eye with him, I could see I had crossed a line. And what's more, it felt bad to cross it, as I too held some weird store in his having conceived me, if even he had done that. You kill a crow, it keeps the rest of them off your field. And you know why, he said? No, because the others will wake him. The bird was a her, I said. Because the others will wake her, they'll screech and croak and they'll not eat, just go back to the trees and cry for a day. And that's when we harvest. And we'll not be robbed blind by them. You see, that's how it was done in the old days. It's the crows or us, Rose. I got off the ladder and paced about on the grass. What was I going to tell Julian? I'd so much hope in his recent sense of happiness with Hermione. I was planning to leave home the following May, you see. I'd a job lined up and everything in a summer camp in New Jersey. So how can I leave Julian here now with our father, who insisted upon running the farm according to rumour and myth rather than sound agricultural knowledge? Haven't the crows as much right to the crop, I said. What do you know about anything? I know I can't leave our fella here with you the way you are, going around killing innocent animals. I don't care what you do, my father said, and looked up at the sky, at the slowly circling crows who must have been appalled at the sight of one of their own tied to a eucalyptus tree, like some kind of offering or strange fruit. Well, my father was certainly the lynching kind, after all, except this was the Irish border and not Alabama, though bar the weather and accents, the two places are twins on many levels. And just a tiny little bit extra further on. So Rose has a dastardly plan to deal with her father, but this is a moment of weakness or softness when we don't know if she's going to go through with it. He doesn't know this, my father, whose name is Dan, but I keep a photo of him when he was in his teens, maybe my age now. I keep it under my pillow. He will be very surprised to find it there, that's for sure. It's black and white and as old as Methuselah. In the photo, he's holding a greyhound puppy, and there's a smile across his face, as wide as the sea, one that exudes gushing, unadulterated joy. His eyes water with it. His love for the puppy is all over that photograph like a good sort of stain. Yet whenever I asked him about having a pup or a dog as a boy, he would shrug and say he'd never any time for animals when he was young, that he'd never any pets. So I believe something happened to him after he joined the Republican War, as he calls it, which he joined when he was 15. He'd not only put away childish things, as they say, but he put away the child and any memory of him. There is something about the photo that helps me exist in the same house as my father, that makes me think he is not a monster, even though that there are others in the vicinity of the border who think differently. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. And as I say, you have to seek out that story to get the full revelation, the full set of revelations.
I'd love to have heard the next bit.
Yes, exactly. You probably are thinking of what's coming.
I can actually see what's reading.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So we'll turn to you, Mary.
Okay. I'm going to read an excerpt from The Black Church, which is a story about a tenement child on the day before the Easter rising and the day of it. So just the story is called The Black Church, and the Black Church lies on Dublin City's north inner city, and the story has been for a long time that if you walked 3 times anti-clockwise around this church, you'd call up the devil. And so this little girl, Jane Ann, she's out on Easter Sunday, and sorry, she has already walked around the church a bit out, so she's done it and she thinks it's nonsense, and her mother dismisses such superstitions anyway. And they live in extreme poverty, and she's often hungry. And the characters in this piece are Jane Ann herself, a Mrs. Anderson, who's a neighbour, and her doll, Belinda, a sort of a cloth doll with a hard head that was rescued out of a shop that had a fire in it, and the doll exploded out of it, and that's how she has the doll. Anne Jane woke on Easter Monday to another bright day. Dad had already left. Although he could not go to the races at Fairy House, he wanted to be on the streets to catch all the gossip as word came of winning horses. Ma didn't get up at all, but clung to the ba and stayed in the horsehair bed behind the dark green curtain that divided the room at night. Anne Jane could hear the ba gurgling and snuffling. Her cold had become a thick and musical cough, like pipes playing out of tune as her small chest attempted to breathe. Anne Jane moved quietly from her own tumbled bedding on the floor. Her brothers lay in deepest sleep. Jimmy's mouth was wide open, and a trail of saliva drooled onto the flour sacking beneath his head. Sean and Tomás were silent, their chests rising and falling gently. Sean's browny fists, his black little fingernails, gripped the 2 woolen blankets that covered his body, as if in sleep he had to be on guard. It was 11:45, almost midday. Just as Anne Jane was making her way down the long stairs, she heard a sound. It was not the usual creaks and dull thuds that were part of the acoustics of the big house in which the different families lived. There was no tin whistle to be heard from the O'Flahertys, nor was it the deep voice of Mr. Toolan as he clobbered his wife, nor was it the secret silence, in itself a sound, that enveloped the floor on which the young Mr. and Mrs. Harry Dunn lived when they closed their door and shut out the world. On one occasion, she had glimpsed inside their tidy little room. There were no clouds to be seen, nor buffeting out from between the cracks in their door. The sound did not emanate from any of the usual sources. She looked around her. Above the ceiling plaster was crumbling, the coving also breaking up with dampness. It was a sound from outside their world, one that she could not quite define because it was not properly within her hearing, so much as in her sense of something about to happen. It was a warning, she decided. So she goes out onto the street. I'm just going to skip a bit. So she's up in the tenements somewhere behind what's now O'Connell Street, but was then called Sackville Place. People were running. She whirled around. From behind, a group of lancers on horses proceeded steadily down the street in the direction of the post office. She pressed her body against the wooden frame of a shop doorway and shrank back as the men then charged until they drew level with the GPO. Anne Jane's hands flew to her ears as the guns fired and split the air. Belinda fell to the ground. Anne Jane dropped to her knees and quickly scooped up her doll again. Almost as quickly, the horsemen galloped back up the street, the people shouting after them. A woman screamed. Not so far from where she stood, someone cursed. Her entire body trembled, her heart like a struck anvil, relentless in her chest. "Ah, Jesus, he's down," someone called out. At this, she sank to her knees and hunched up very small. Something terrible was happening. It was the devil's revenge for not being called at midnight, for having been fooled with in the middle of an Easter Sunday, God's holiest day. Anne Jane didn't know how long she stayed there, watching from her position close to the ground. All she knew was that the sun had almost disappeared and the street lights had begun to glimmer. What was she waiting for when hell seemed to be rising around them in the streets? Clutching Belinda tightly to her chest, she lisped and whispered, soothing herself at the pop, 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 which she'd heard not so long ago from Mr. Morosini's shop, where this is where the doll burst out. There was a fire in a shop. There would be fire, she knew, and brimstone, which was apparently worse. And instead of dolls' heads popping, there would be devilish attempts to take the humans away from their innocent days with their hungry bellies. Pop, 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 pop. She listened again and crouched on her hunkers for a long time. But then she stirred. Her eyes tried to focus. Could it be? She snapped her eyes shut in case what she saw was not real, then as quickly snapped them open. It was real. Slowly, she pushed herself to her feet, shaking her right foot, which had gone numb. There was Mrs. Anderson pushing a pram towards the conflagration, face flushed and happy. How peculiar, Anne Jane thought, to be pushing an empty pram so happily down the street, when Mrs. Anderson's children were all grown, and surely the shops were closed, and there would be broken glass everywhere. But Mrs. Anderson had spotted her and paused, holding the pram with one hand and placing the other one on her hip. She was still wearing her everyday apron, although a red felt hat was perched jauntily on her head. Child, what are you doing here? Anne Jane shook her head as if warning Mrs. Anderson to stay away. There was too much danger. Child, do you hear me? What are you doing, Anne Jane Gleeson, when the city is in uproar? Are you lightheaded? She was lightheaded. How correctly Mrs. Anderson had observed that. She was lightheaded with fear, not hunger. The woman approached her then, pulling the pram behind her, and stuck out her left hand. You'd be better off with me, my angel, she said firmly, catching the child by the elbow and drawing her towards her. They approached a shop window in which the glass had been smashed and splintered. People crowded in, stepping over one another, jostling and pushing, such was the rush. There was bread, crisscrossed and plaited, and bursting, shiny crusted loaves scored with a knife. And there were cakes and sweets and more chocolate than Anne Jane could ever have imagined as they followed the crowd inside. There was no fire or brimstone, merely glass to be avoided, and at last fresh, sweet offerings on an altar of plenty. There you are, child. Sure, don't you like fairy cakes too? Of course you do. Of course you do. Thank you.
Thank you both for those great readings. And I'm sure I'm not the only person in the room who is making connections between them, which happens, you know, when you put two writers into confluence in a way, because you have the superstition of the hanging up the crow, and you have the go 3 times around the black church, call up the devil and cause the rebellion to happen. But you're also using the point of view of a young person. So we've Rose and we've Anne Jane Gleeson. And I mean, point of view is always really interesting, you know, for writers to consider, isn't it, in terms of whose story is it, how will you begin to tell it, from what angle will you come? And the other thing that just struck me, and I think this does resonate in a lot of your other writings, that the kind of pull of history, the long view of history, and making, as you said, making the famine story, but feel very pertinent to, you know, the mess we've since been making. And in your case, Mary, you know, dealing with those kind of extremes that we've had in Ireland from time to time. Could you talk a bit about that, in a sense, how you, as an artist or as artists, feel that, do you feel you have a social responsibility to some extent to history, or do you feel there's such a thing as outside history? Tell us more about those kind of crunch moments.
Should I answer that?
Yes, I'd love you.
I mean, I don't feel any social responsibility to history, though despite that I have written things which are sometimes taken as social realism, or speaking about, you know, they have a certain topicality sometimes. This is, you know, separate from lyric poetry and that. So I don't feel that that's my role at all. I mean, it has been said that some artists, in a way, they're kind of prescient, so they can sometimes unwittingly, they're writing ahead of something that is going to be resolved at some point, but they don't do that deliberately and they're not aware of it. I think it is just part of the act of imagination to let oneself go as far out as possible along the spectrum, right to the edge and beyond, you know, ideally, without any social, you know, restraints or anything like that. So what do I feel? I think that, you know, everyone here, and artists or whatever, we are all responsive, responding humans, and that sensate quality, I think, finds it is something that I would draw on in my work.
And I mean, there is the argument that the individual artist, if they have a chance to sit at a desk and have the time to do so, the writing they do, it is a political act, because it's a moment of creativity that's, you know, outside the kind of other constraints that we all work under and live under.
Yeah, it is, but also I think there's great freedom sometimes in some writing, and that has been my experience of it. So things that I'm not saying very comfortable in, you know, you know, if I was on a panel, let's say on or somewhere, an academic, I'm not as comfortable with that as I am in the world of writing, because I feel I can say what I want to say there better. It suits me better, really. So, and that includes the topical work.
Yeah, sometimes on those panels you kind of feel there's so many agendas flying about the place here that
Yes, and everybody's right. So I don't really want to be right. I just want to WRITE.
Yes, thank you very much. long way that continue. What about yourself, Jackie?
Well, I mean, I live in Dundalk, so I think it's pretty impossible once you start putting pen to paper and you even say the word Dundalk, we say the border, it's pretty impossible to avoid. It just comes, you know. So the area, the landscape, the history of that area, literally, it feeds the material either in a big way or the tiniest way, but it's forever there. And sometimes I don't, you know, write about where I live necessarily, you know, I write lots of different things. Belfast Girls, I mean, there's one character who I have from Dundalk, and strangely enough, she is the most, I would say, she's quite radical, you know, the character of Sarah. So yeah, so for me, it's a default really because of where I live. Social responsibility. I think I possibly do feel a tiny bit of sense of that. I want to get it right. I want to be balanced. I want to reach out and hear all the voices. Like, again, if I go back to Belfast Girls, there are several viewpoints in that. There's just not one viewpoint. There's the viewpoint that, you know, grain was shipped out by the British, and there's the viewpoint that it wasn't. So there's all these viewpoints, so that you can have a debate within the play. That's just one example. There's lots of other viewpoints. So yeah, I think a lot of it's determined by where I live and how I view it, and possibly also because I grew up there, but then I left for London and then I came back, so I have slight outsider's view too. So
I think that's really interesting,
Yeah.
actually, what you've done, because and I'm wondering if it's partly because you were away for a good while that you came back and did this. Like, I grew up on the border in Monaghan, and it was only the one book in which I tried to speak about the troubles was it didn't come out till 2014. I've been sitting all my life having, and I didn't know. First of all, for a long time I didn't feel like writing about it, and then things started falling into place, and I did want to write about the disappeared, but it took years. I think you had the advantage of distance.
It's true, and the longer I'm there, I'm gonna have to leave, I think, to write about it again. The longer I'm there, I'm more entrenched, and there's definitely an element of that. And I believe Conor O'Callaghan, you know, the poet, is writing a novel about the emergency set on the border again, and he's not really gone there in his poetry. So there's something about fiction, maybe, and maybe drama too, that can make those journeys. Whereas, you know, with poetry, I'm writing about tomato plants, and you know, other things. I'm very rarely political in my poetry, so probably depends on the forms.
So yes, you mentioned poetry, and you're working on, or it's pretty much there, I think, your first book of poetry.
I had it for ages.
Yes, that's what I was thinking. I'm sure it was there. Yes,
it's just that if you're, you know, it's in the middle of a second collection of short stories, and this novel that I've been working on for years, and I thought, why would I put this collection of poetry out in the middle of doing that? So I just sort of took a cue from somebody like Muriel Spark, who also wrote poetry, but was writing novels. And then years later took out a book of poetry. I just don't feel a pressure, probably because I'm doing other things, but I do want to get it out. I mean, you know, I think it's important, but
yeah, no, please do. We're waiting for this. I should say that
confuse everybody, or no, not everybody, but me probably.
I should mention possibly that Jackie is with my publisher, Saren, who did her short stories. who also publish poetry. So I think that's
Yeah.
like that's the marriage made in heaven,
Yeah,
potentially.
exactly.
But also I find, wondering what you think about this, Mary, that the same people don't necessarily read prose and poetry. A lot of people don't read poetry at all,
That's for sure.
who would read a novel. And even the ones who would read a novel might kind of sniff a bit of the short story. I'm not sure what you find.
Well, I see. Yeah, they tend to be separate camps, I think, you know, and because, well, I see. Yeah, most people aren't really reading poetry. They're not burning up to go out and buy a book of poetry, you know. And sometimes when I'm giving workshops, I usually finish off by saying, if it's a poetry workshop, I say, look, ask someone to give you a stocking filler at Christmas of somebody's poetry book, you know, to buy a book. I'm sure they never do, but I do, you know, it'll be a nice stocking filler, a book of poetry by somebody, you know.
Yes.
And it could be a life-changing one as well, if you get the right book, you know. But I think in fiction there are more readers, and therefore there's less of a sense of desperation among its writers, I feel, because they know they may have some readers, whereas it's with poems, like, I love your attitude that you're not in any hurry. I'd say that's unusual, isn't it, in the world of
I would say
poetry,
that is
for
unusual.
someone with a collection. You know? No,
definitely. I mean, it's a funny thing. I find if you've a poem in the Irish Times, everybody goes, "Oh, you're a poet." And you're going, I do have several books. Like, now you exist because you've been in the Irish Times, and thankfully the Irish Times still publishes poems.
Well, that's possibly one reason why I should have, because nobody knows that I write poetry.
There you go. Yeah.
So, and when I was doing my MPhil at Trinity, I was really very focused on poetry. So, yeah, that's a good enough reason.
Yeah, no, I was interested by what you sort of began to say potentially there, Mary, about lyric poetry that seemed to be in a way coming from a different place, not on the same sort of track as the fiction. Would that be true, that the lyric has its own set of demands?
Well, yeah, for me it has anyway. But well, I was actually going to separate what's the poetry, the type of poetry that I'm writing. So there's lyric poetry, certainly, but there's the other stuff, one or two of which I might read from later, and that is more sometimes maybe more rhetorical than it should be, but it's the stuff that really burns me up at times. Where I am reacting to the world, and you know, there's nothing, I'm not getting the feeling, you know, the soft feeling that I was talking about.
It's a different feeling.
This is a different thing. It's
things
very
have to
burning.
change type
It's
of
very burning.
feeling.
Yes, and needs, you know, and I need to say this. It's a case of I need to say this.
Yes, yeah, brilliant. Well, hopefully you'll treat us to one or two of those. So, staying along this sort of slightly political tack, can I ask you how you feel things have changed, or have they changed for writers who are women in Ireland in the decades you've been writing?
Mary?
Well, I think that they have changed radically since, well, I began publishing in the 1980s, and so every woman who happened to write at that time was called a woman poet or a woman writer. So we were the, you know, men were the default. And so it was all that. And, you know, you did get asked some really stupid questions a lot of the time. But I think it gradually softened, and particularly the generation below mine, let's say, you know, the Vona Groarks, the Katrina O'Reillys, David Wheatley, Justin Quinn, that generation, I think, shifted something in that their work was just taken more seriously, and times were changing, I suppose. But the women in the 80s were very influenced by, I think, what was happening in America politically, and that did influence some of our work, I think. And Yvonne Boland, she took her cue from people like Marilyn Hacker and
Adrian Rich.
Yeah, you've written about, I mean, you've written a book about her, so you know all that. But that was trickling down to everybody else, I think, as well. So it was quite influential.
Yeah.
I think it seems to me that I think that younger poets of all or no genders now, you know, have a more comfortable place to sit in without, you know, like a male poet once said to me, oh, well, you need to be able to write a sonnet, a political poem and a love poem. Like, that was it.
So if you tick those boxes,
so you had all that sort
you'd
of
be a poet.
nonsense, and people were very sure of themselves. I like that it's more fluid now. I like that. I think that there are different movements in poetry within Ireland. You know, almost different schools, and of course, it's being taught as a creative subject as well, and that has a big influence.
Well, so talking about influence, it's always interesting to hear how you have found your teachers, let's say, whether they be alive or dead, in terms of the influence on your own work. Can you speak to us about that maybe, and maybe even tell us a bit about who you're currently reading or obsessed by?
Okay, well, my physical teachers, I'm not sure were an enormous influence on me. I did have Anne Devlin she was a visiting fellow on the MPhil at Trinity, and she was great, and I actually loved her when I saw her work. She wrote a wonderful play called After Easter in mid-90s. But I think I am taught by what I read. So, and even, you know, this book, The Scattering, so that came out in 2013. At the time, I was really reading a lot of David Foster Wallace, and I just loved, I loved what he was doing with sentences, just very long sentences. And it's funny because then we read John McGregor and the sentences, at least, you know, what I've read so far, are short, but I still think there's a wonderful energy there. But yeah, so I was reading a lot of David Foster Wallace. I think he was a teacher in a way because I think he experimented a lot, and sometimes it's nice, I think, to have an experimental teacher as a, you know, somebody that you're reading, because you'll open your head up a lot. And even if then you come away, like I probably come away from him, he died in 2004, even earlier maybe. There was some posthumously published things. Even though I've come away from probably that big influence, I think I learned a lot from him. And then, I don't know, John McGahern, which is a completely different style, completely and utterly.
But he's definitely a stylist as well.
Yeah, exactly. Then I've also really loved, you know, E.M. Forster, Howard's End, those kind of books that are very beautiful stories and full of heart as well. I mean, I still, you know, Howard's End still does it for me, and of course the Brontes. But anyway, so the books that you love definitely teach you. I think I've learned from them. And say poetry, I love Alice Oswald. I love her. She experiments as well. I think, you know, I love her love of language and things that she does in her poetry. Sometimes it's slightly impenetrable, but I don't mind that. So yeah, I've had fantastic physical teachers, but maybe, you know, I have Brendan Kennelly, and he's wonderful, but probably learned more from reading.
I think as writers we do, don't we?
Yeah.
We read as writers, sort of, you know, what is she doing in the third paragraph? How did she turn that around?
Exactly.
And what about yourself, Mary? I mean, they probably changed over the years.
It's changed over the years. I just always read, and I think it's almost the most important part of being a writer. So, well, you know, I've read all sorts of things, but books that really left a lasting impression on me, and one would be by I've mentioned, I think, to Jackie once, Elias Canetti. He was a Bulgarian-born Jewish writer. He wrote a book in the 1930s called Auto da Fe.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So and I did a master's on his work years ago on just the theme of death in that novel. But the sort of characters that he depicts, really interested me. They were, I suppose they were psychologically not balanced really, but of course that, I think, gave them access to all kinds of insights. I tend to think that way anyway, you see, so it suited me very well. So I've never really left Elias Canetti in the bunker, and I'm sure that he had an influence whispering in my ear when it came to write the Elysium Testament, my third novel. And I was interested, you see, my background was partly in philosophy, and I think Nietzsche influenced me, and such things. But the books that always sat in my head, and I don't think anyone reads them now, The Once and Future King by T.H. White, I think his name is. It's about the Arthurian legends really, but told in a very novel style. It's not like reading about myths as such, and Merlin. It's a wonderful, wonderful book, but it's also an allegory, I think, for something turning towards dictatorship. And the other one that I liked was the Alexandria Quartet by Lawrence Durrell. Well, it took me a while to get through those, but there's something about those and the writing in them.
Yeah,
but now I just read anything and everything. But they're sort of key big blocks in me somewhere.
Yeah, you know? they stay in you, don't they? They sort of live somewhere in the cells.
They live there.
Yeah, they do. And every now and again they sort of
you know, like that fantasy Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast. I bet you've read. You know, Gormenghast is just a phenomenal work of fantasy in a way that it's not like modern fantasy.
Yeah, there's a full world there to explore, isn't there? So I might ask you to read again, because I think it's really about the text. That's what we're about as writers. And just to introduce your new bit, whatever you're going to read from, and tell us a bit about it. Yeah.
Well, I didn't bring any poems with me, and I hate reading off the phone.
Yeah, so, no, it doesn't have to be poems.
So so I brought the second manuscript of second collection of short stories. So I thought I'd read something from that. So it's sticking with fiction, if that's okay. And I need to change the glasses because I couldn't see the last ones. Okay, so just a few minutes from a short story. Can everyone hear me sitting down here? Okay, just a few minutes from a short story. This is set in space, in the future, on an all-female docking station for an all-female planet called XX. Okay. The station. Pearl sat at the control desk, staring out into the darkness. There was still something intoxicating to her about space, even though she'd been on the station for over 2 years. Any brightness at all, a distant star or satellite, passing spacecrafts or debris, caught her eye like birds had done when she was a child. She brought the same captive attention to the bright things she saw, and such chinks in the permanent blackness often made her feel sad because of her memories of birds. As she sat back in the swivel chair, lost in her thoughts on the night shift, she heard the entry buzzer ring once, then several times in quick succession. Alarmed, she put her mouthpiece on and gripped the microphone. XX docking station, how can I help? At the other end of the line was a male voice, crackling and urgent. He appeared to want immediate entry. It's impossible, Pearl said. She was about to end the call. The request was not an uncommon one. Travellers other than those scheduled to arrive with craft difficulties or had run out of supplies had often requested entry to or help from the station, and the response was always the same. No to the male travellers, a yes definitely to the female. Good luck, Pearl said, but the voice was insistent. Of course I know the Galaxy Act, do you? The Act says you cannot enter XX atmosphere. We have strict. The voice proceeded to tell Pearl that she was wrong, that the Galaxy Act had in fact been amended. I'll have to check, she said. She pressed the buzzer for the captain's room. Barbara, I'm so sorry, but you need to get down here. She cut the call dead before Barbara had a chance to reprimand her, which Pearl could hear from her captain's tone was definitely likely. She returned to the call and heard a loud explosion down the line. It had such force, she clutched her ears to wring out the noise like water from a wet cloth. She placed the earpiece over one ear. The pad slanted forward onto her lobe. The man was now panicking. Which engine? She said. Look, calm down. My name? Pearl. Yours? She felt the presence then of Barbara behind her, removed her mouthpiece and turned towards her captain, who Pearl could see was frantically chewing her lip. I heard on my radio, it's an exploratory mission from Earth. Ship went down 2 hours ago. That must be the survivor. How many engines left? None, Pearl said. He says the Galaxy Act has been changed. Did you know about that? Barbara nodded and looked to the floor. Actually, we've been working on a press release. I just never thought it would impact us so soon. Now it turns out we must assist all persons in distress, no matter what their gender. Pearl could hear the male screaming at her down the line. Do I or don't I open the shaft? Pearl said. Barbara pulled up a chair and sat beside her officer. His current position outside the station, as in clinging to the edge of the fucking ship. Barbara sat back and shook her head. Remind me to due to insubordination in your file. Will do, ma'am, Pearl said. The captain tapped the counter. If we disobey the new Galaxy Act, we'll be fined. There may be sanctions on XX. Everyone on it will hate us, she said. The buzzer rattled incessantly on the desk, as if the man outside had thrown his whole weight against it. Captain, I think we need to open the shaft, Pearl said. Wait, call Claire. Within minutes, Claire was in the control room, her hands covered in soil. She carried a large houseplant. What is it? The biologist said. The captain readied herself, unpacked a gun from her holster. She checked it for bullets and cocked it. We have a visitor, Barbara said. Cool. Who is it? Claire said. I'll tell you who it is. It buggered up Earth and everything on it. That's who. Barbara walked to the shaft, pressed the 4-digit entry code into the panel, and pulled down the lever. There was a trembling, whirring sound, and the shaft door opened. The man Pearl had been speaking to fell into the space as if thrown from a catapult. He was in a corporation logoed spacesuit, which was torn to ribbons and covered in black oil, but which had nonetheless cushioned his fall. When he stood and removed his helmet, the women noticed, all in their own way, in a different order of detail, that he was tall, blonde, long-haired, and in his mid to late 30s. Barbara turned to her 2 officers and said, that, ladies, is the male of the species. He says his name's Kurt, Pearl said. Barbara continued to point to her gun at the man while Pearl faced him with clenched fists ready for any potential fight, just as she had seen in films, especially cowboy films, of life with men on Earth, while Claire smiled and said, welcome to the station, Kurt.
Welcome to the station, indeed. Dot, dot, dot.
Yeah.
It's basically Playboy, the Western world in space.
Oh, brilliant. This is going to go down well. We can tell already.
Yeah.
Excellent, wonderful. Thank you very much. So yes, well, it's such a treat to be here this evening and be with all of you and hear these wonderful writers. So let's keep it going now, asking Mary to
All right.
give us some.
I'm going to read a few poems just for a few minutes. Now, I hadn't made up my mind what to read. Okay, I'll start with a lyric poem that has a political edge, I suppose. This was in response to one of Patrick Kavanagh's poems. And I can't remember the name of the actual name of it at the moment. It's about a blackbird, all right. So mine is called The Blackbird, God Almighty and Allah. And it was remembering the dead children of Syria murdered by Bashar al-Assad. There you are again this bitter spring, taking position at crown of birch. You hold forth like God Almighty or Allah, fresh arrived to change terrible places to green shook and calm. Listening to you, all bright breast, slick song, you'd swear that religions were ready at last for a pagan such as you or me to offer natural gospel, a peaceful Quran. but world is never ready for melodies of yellow beak. The glossed feather of your black sleekness testing its metal, proving year on year that when the bones have crumbled within shallow graves, you still return and offer a dance of dances, sparking euphony, automatic as dawn, inevitable as sunset. Do not bless me, God or Allah. No need, while in the garden lives this most high creature. Now, this one is called It Wasn't a Woman. It was a poem, it's just something that just, dawned on me and came very suddenly together, and I felt I have to write this down. It wasn't a woman who used a stick to abort the baby in an 11-year-old girl, who gang raped a 14-year-old, who opened a woman to a room of shamrock green rugby shirts, later texting about spit roast and sluts, who gave money to a rag picker, took one of her 5 children to a faraway brown dust city, who sold her on to the businessman. It wasn't a woman who beat the child with an iron bar so that vertebrae were crushed. It wasn't a woman who ruptured the rectum of a small boy, who broke the vagina of a baby girl. It wasn't a woman who scalded a wife because she spoke to another man, who flung acid in the face of a girl who did not want to marry, who poured caustic soda on a wife's genitals in a quiet Irish town. It wasn't a woman who broke a nose, blackened an eye, bit a cheek so that the marks of those teeth are telltale pits in the skin and her breasts are purple and green. It wasn't a woman who punched the baby out of her so she bled to death. It wasn't a woman who rejected those twin girls. It wasn't a woman who burned a widow to death, who shouted at a wife in the rich people's shopping mall, who later forced her to have sex, took the children away, kept all the money, who called out names like dog and here, bitch, who put a collar around her neck, then led her on all fours around a golden apartment. It wasn't a woman who smashed photo frames and perfume bottles, who kept a gun beside the bed and threatened to use it, who blamed her even as he punched her, roared the rhythms of cunt face, cunt face, cunt face, because it helped hit her harder. It wasn't a woman, it wasn't a woman, it wasn't a woman. And I'll just read one more. This one is called My Mother Says No on Bloomsday, and I happened to be in Monaghan, where the summer before my mother died, I was in Monaghan on Bloomsday, and as you know, in Ireland on Bloomsday, some people dress up in costume, and the word yes is very much in the air after Molly Bloom in the final sequence. And anyway, I was trying to get my mother into the shower. My mother says no on Bloomsday. It is not easy to wheel an old woman to the shower on Bloomsday when the world and Molly cry, yes, yes, yes. And she is saying no, 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 because what's left of her life depends on the freedom of no. How Joycean of her to resist the cleaned up conscience of filial attention, your need to fix her taints and odors, wash hair and teeth, attend to toes, when all she wants is to float on the lily leaf of her own green bedspread, drowsing Molly in a tangle of snow-white hair. Now dreams enclose her more than talk of showers or meals. The flowing waters of memory rise and touch her skin, just where the mattress eases spine and bones in that yellow-walled room. Hello, my darling, she greets his photograph, flinging kisses towards mottled frame. To her, then, the logic of love. To her, the logic of no, her tongue untamable. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being so generous to read twice. It's been an absolute treat. So I'd like to open this up to the floor then. You may not see these writers in person too often, so now is your chance to ask them the burning question that you want to ask. And if it's about your own development as a writer, that's fine. Whatever you want to ask, there's no silly questions. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me from here?
Yes.
All right. So I would like to say thank you for having this event and coming here and talking with us today. I actually got the wonderful opportunity, thanks to my arts professor, to read your writing. And I was particularly interested in Miss Jackie's The Emperor of Russia. I think it was an amazing work. And I do have some questions that, you know, it tickles me a little bit, but I'm afraid that if I ask them, it's going to be a spoiler for people who haven't read it. Is that okay?
I think, you know, we're all sort of readers together, so,
Right.
you know, it won't spoil it. It'll just make it even more tantalizing.
All right. Well, it's a really nice book. Everyone should read it. It's not book, sorry, short story. It's amazing. You guys should read it. And I actually had to read it 3 times because the first time I went through it, I was just going through it. And then towards the end, I was like, wait, what? Go back. So like, it's amazing. So I was just wondering, there are a few things actually. So I'm gonna quote some lines from your short story just to make things clear. There's this one line that really took me from your story. It was towards the end where Rose says, ... the tenderness in my father's voice, which had always been there, I realized, had I bothered to listen to it. So that one line struck me because I realized that a lot of stories, they have a lot of foreshadowing. And your story in particular, it actually does have a little bit of foreshadowing in terms of Julian and his existence right now, to give it a little bit away. So I was wondering whether you did foreshadow this tenderness in the father's, you know, voice throughout the beginning of your story, because from what I saw, it's like very harsh father, and like, you know, the lines are not very tender, as one might put it. So like, is there any foreshadowing there? Or in another sense, is that also part of Rose's delusion?
Okay, great question. I think there isn't that much foreshadowing at the beginning. And that's because it's to set up, not that he's a brute, but that it's a very brusque, he's a brusque guy. And that's the relationship. And you can still be nice and be brusque. So in a way it's neutral. So you don't know which way it's going to go. So where you can see, so there's because I'm very interested in psychology anyway, but there's layers to this man. And where you see it crack, I think, if I remember properly, but where you see it crack is when he talks about why he had to leave, and this experience, the experiences he has on the border, when the soldiers are always asking him for the papers to go to his own farm because he's on the border. And so he's very annoyed about it, but you sort of feel sorry for him. So you see it there, and there's a couple of other occasions when he's hard and he's brusque, and I know she calls him a bastard and all this kind of thing, and he's probably very charming, a real Jack the Lad character, but he isn't necessarily someone to kill, you know. So she's hard, she's been hard on him, and that's the whole story, is this how was I going to mix up this love and hatred, you know, because even when I read it, you know, I feel the love, even when she's calling him a total bastard. I just feel, I'm hoping that comes across, and I wanted to set myself that challenge, that this love would ooze out between this very hard exterior, you know, and I think it does.
It does.
Yeah, so, and that I wanted to try to do, you know, because I think that I'm not saying I had the same relationship with my father, but we had a very, it was, you know, I love my dad a lot, but we had a very we joked with each other very loudly. And that, I don't know, maybe that's quite Irish, I don't know, but and the love is behind everything. So that, yeah, so I wanted to try that. So I'm not foreshadowing, but I'm keeping it neutral for a while. That's what I think I'm doing.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
I have one more question, if that's okay. So this is also from another part of the book, which is naming. So I feel like most writers, they give a name for a specific character. It might not be the main character, but a certain character. They give it for a reason. And especially in your story, you actually explained the name of the character, which is the crow named Hermione. I believe it was taken from Winter's Tale.
The Winter's
Shakespeare's
Tale.
Winter's Tale.
Yeah.
Because it was mentioned so explicitly, Shakespeare's Winter's Tale, and also like she says that as if I didn't know why you named her that,
Yes.
Julian, or the Ghost of Julian, and also how Hermione is like kind of a focal point of the story. It's mentioned quite often. Is there a specific reason why Shakespeare's Winter's Tale was, connected to this story?
Well, I think in the Winter's Tale, Leontes abandons his daughter.
Yeah.
So I think that's the core thing. The child is given away, and later there's love. It's not a huge thing, and really it's thematically, but he does abandon his daughter, and he loses everybody. Loses his wife, loses his son. I mean, it's not too different from Dan. But really, the real reason why I quote it, apart from those subtle connections, is that she absolutely loves that line, that she would have studied this play at school, and because her dad's not there, this line, "The Emperor of Russia was my father," that helps her build him up into this giant figure in his absence. Of course, when he's back, she hates him. So it's really, that is the line that when she was learning it at school, just made her think of her dad. So did I answer that question?
Yeah, it connects things really well. Thank you so much for answering.
Wonderful questions, showing a really close
Detailed.
Yes. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
So is there anyone else who'd like to ask something of our two writers? Yes, thank you.
I guess something I'm interested in is like your opinion on like writing about a character that is kind of far from your life, and I guess like how far your own imagination, your own compassion can get you in like getting into the mind of a character who is from a different class from you, and like those kind of differences. And do you believe that there's a limit to how far you should go as a writer into the minds of others and into their experiences in your writing?
Yeah, I think that's a very apt question for now, isn't it? We're hearing different opinions on that. So Mary, you're gestating there.
Yeah, I'm permanently gestating something. First part of your question was, could you just repeat the first part of it again?
So I guess the first part is like, I guess the question is just about how far do you go with compassion and imagination and others, and then secondly, would you say that there's a firm limit on how far is appropriate for a writer?
Oh yeah, and you're asking how far you can, go into a type of character that you don't actually know or isn't within your experience, that sort of thing. Yeah, what did I say? I mean, certainly some characters are drawn from or based on experience or knowledge of something, but I do think there's quite a lot of writing happens and characters are built purely imagined, or they will be a composite perhaps of something, I think you can go as far as is good for your work, and that would be the thing. The further the better, if it's okay. In terms of you're not talking about in terms of theme now at all, or subject or anything, are you? It's more character.
I think it's more about kind of character, mainly about
I'm just thinking, I mean, all the characters in this book, Empire, well, I would say 90% of them are totally imagined. which is unusual for me because in most of my novels there is usually some factor that isn't too far from my own life, some element. But in Empire, these historical short stories, they were largely very much invented, though some things like place, I was able to situate some of them in places that I know intimately and had a feeling for. I think it helps if you have a feeling either for the place, and you can build the characters into that, you know. That helps.
I mean, I think nowadays when identity is a key factor, there seems to be a certain sway against writers having the imaginative freedom.
That's right.
For instance,
yeah.
you know, to write a character who's a different race, different class, you mentioned, or otherwise different. And I mean, it's really, each individual writer answers that themselves. I don't know if you have had to think about this.
Yeah, I mean, Judith in Belfast Girls is a mixed race or mixed heritage, I suppose, character. And the thing about that is, I think, and it's a direct answer to your question as well, I think when you're researching something, Judith is not somebody that I know at all, but when you're researching something and you do so much research in, this is if your thing is idea based and you want to do this thing, and I wanted to do this thing about the orphan girls, the research starts to throw up people that you meet on, you know, in your research. And when I was researching Belfast Girls and I was looking at the registries of all the girls who left, and suddenly I see 2 were born in Jamaica, you know, leaving the ships from Belfast. And I go, that is an incredible piece of information. So I just worked with that piece of information and then I create these characters. So you can, research can, and so, you know, I think that's, because Judith is also Irish, I think I totally get away with that, you know. I might not if she wasn't, I don't know, but she's Irish, so that's okay. But the first part of your question, I think if you're researching something, the answer to characters coming up, that you don't know these at all, they've just come from research, you know. Maybe as you're writing them, people you know sort of come under their clothes a little bit, just so you know how you know, something is drunk or what they wear, or little, you know, helps with little detail, but the research really helps find people that I don't know at all. So yeah,
very good question. Thank you.
Yeah.
So we've probably time for one more. Do I see a hand on this side? No. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
It's interesting that both of you talk about how different poetry and prose, especially novel writing, as a form are, and how you feel like when you have an idea, like it either demands to be written as a poem or as prose, but how does writing both of those genres inspire the other?
Thank you.
I'm not sure that they inspire one another in my case particularly. I think what happened was that I became aware at a certain time when I was writing only poetry, that there were other things I wanted to say and I felt they wouldn't suit the form of poetry. So I just thought, oh well, I'll try a short story. And you know, that's the way it worked for me. It wasn't, and then I wasn't sure about a novel. Would I ever do a novel? But I did want to, because there were other things I felt would only be contained in a longer piece. And my husband said to me, you know, when I was about, I don't know, 34 or something, well, you know, are you planning on living forever? And that really helped me, actually. It was a very grounding thing to say, because you do meet people all the time who are putting it off and putting it off. I'm sure you've met them yourselves. And so, you know, yeah, but I don't think that they influence one another very greatly in my case. I think of them as separate engines turning over the whole time. And when you're working on with one of these, it's the one that's roaring loudest, you know. I don't do anything else. I don't write poetry if I'm writing prose, for example.
Now, how do you find that? It's very interesting.
Mostly what Mary said is true
Yeah.
for me too, and we talked earlier about crossovers. But sometimes, I mean, I wrote a poem about, you know, the myth of Sweeney, but a female Sweeney. And as you know, it was published in one of those, one of the Daedalus anthologies. I just thought, this is a play, a long monologue. This is more, and it's sort of the same thing as we've talked about earlier. It's not that it inspired it. It's just that you feel there's some sort of excitement in it that's not been nailed completely in the poem, and so it's more. But that, I think that it's rare enough. Definitely, it's rare enough that happens, but it does happen. And I actually remember Sebastian Barry saying that, I don't know which novels, but a lot of his novels have roots in poems that he wrote. So something that he wrote stayed in his mind, it wasn't finished, and he took it to a novel later.
Revisiting, yeah. How interesting. Well, we could go on all night, but I think we will have to finish up. I want to thank you, the audience, because the quality of your listening was really good. I think both writers would attest to that. So that's really appreciated, and you clearly appreciate Mary and Jackie being here. And they're here now for, you know, you can come up and talk to them. I hope that's okay, folks.
Yeah.
You know, if there was something you wanted to ask, but you felt too shy, or I've cut you off by finishing on time. But we want to, of course, thank our wonderful guests, and thank you all.